general question. One of the things that GPs often need is in-the-moment advice. So let's pretend I have a patient who comes to me and they're talking about some potential violation. They're very upset because a member of their family they think is being, abused in a police case or something, the sort of thing that your company, your charity deals with. Can we come to you? Can we ask for off-the-record advice? Because, I need that sort of, where do I take this to test it out in a confidential and off-the-record manner? Because it's beyond my remit, but I don't want to ignore this because I'm hearing it from this patient who says there's a real problem. We've had the same with hospitals, when somebody complains, one of the things in Francis was there were complaints coming to third parties, but the third parties didn't always follow them up. And I always feel when you've got that prick of conscience, you should, but I'm interested in whether we can bring that to you.
The short answer is yes. These are tough times for advice, for legal help and advice. The landscape of civil legal aid has just completely changed during my career. It's so hard to come by now. Legal aid law firms and law centres have shut down. People just can't, make it work within the funding constraints, which frankly, in my view, have been as ideological in being an attack on the legal profession and legal advice, as much driven by that as any kind of austerity measure. But we have an advice line that can be phoned at certain hours, and we have email addresses that you can use, and it will be confidential, and we'll give you our thoughts on what you might say to your patient or where you might refer them, and in some cases you might refer them directly to us. So thank you for that.
Hi there, my name is Matt Pickover. I'm a GP. I suppose that latter bit isn't necessary in this place, but we seem to be living in a time of destruction and denigration. Lots of great British institutions are being eroded through the efforts of our esteemed government. How do those of us that want to make a difference to our society in the context of that opposition to a better country, almost, do that with the prospect that the next opportunity to make those choices is 4.5 years' time?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to say, please join Liberty. We are a bit lawyer-heavy, and we could really do with having some people with a broader experience, which is the kind of experience that you get in your surgeries, the kind of stuff that you hear would be incredibly valuable to us in our various campaigns, whether they are on access to justice, whether they are on saving the Human Rights Act, whether they are campaigns for proportionate surveillance or whatever it happens to be. So we'd love you to do that. I think that this is a moment of enormous adversity, but also opportunity. I think there's a restlessness which can be dangerous but can also be constructive. And I think it is a moment not just for politics but for civil society, not just for party politics but for civil society, including speaking up for professions and institutions before they are denigrated away and destroyed.
Thank you. Number 3.
One of the things that GPs are being asked to do a lot at the moment is share our patients' data. We've heard a lot from you and from other people about the human aspect of the consultation, and it's one of the things that makes being a GP so good. And a lot of us feel quite uncomfortable about being asked to give away this data that we hold very securely in our surgeries. And how do we balance those two things? Because the pressure on us to do that is enormous, and we're guilted into it because we have to do it for research purposes, etc. How do we balance that risk?
Well, I don't think you should be guilted into anything, but because there is a legal framework here in terms of Article 8 and in terms of data protection. Now, I know that now by statute, in certain cases, by law, that's been overridden. So you, unless people opt out, you're supposed to hand over all sorts of patient information to be used for secondary purposes. And we can have the debate about whether those purposes are proportionate or not and whether they're good, but they weren't the purposes for which the data was created and given. And even with the new legislative framework on this health and social care data, if your patients opt out, then that's then, I mean, I prefer opt-in when you're asking people to share their intimate information. That's my starting point. But even under the law, the unsatisfactory state of the law as it is, there is an opt-out, and you are perfectly within your rights to tell your patients that they can opt out. And if they give you an unequivocal dissent to their data being shared, then that's it. And any authority or any agency that then wants to take the data, can be resisted because your patient has not given has dissented from that data sharing.
Number 4.
Good morning. My name's Neil Coleman. I'm a GP in Slough. I'm also a trustee of the local hospice based in Windsor. And I was just wondering whether Liberty has a particular view or policy on assisted dying, something that's recently been discussed in Parliament.
It's one of the hardest, the beginning of life and the end of life that you're involved. Your stuff is basically the hardest stuff, I think, in terms of human rights. And human rights are an ethical framework as well as a legal framework. I have, in past years, represented people who wanted the law changed because they would actually live a better end of life if they knew that they would get help at the end of it. And there is that sometimes perverse incentive to take your life earlier than you would want or need to, because you know that you would be putting your loved one at risk of prosecution if you left it till later on, because you just won't be able to take your life by your own hand, by even swallowing the pill or whatever it is. On the other hand, I do appreciate legitimate human rights and ethical concerns about pressures on people who are, very old or disabled, whether it's psychological and familial pressures, or frankly just enforcement difficulties with demonstrating or disproving the suggestion that this was consensual. It's very, very difficult, and I don't know where it will end up. But I suspect at some point this won't be resolved in the courts. The European Court of Human Rights has now spoken more than once and sees this as a very political, democratic dilemma. I suspect that we are probably in this country moving to a consensus that some kind of tightly regulated possibility of assistance in certain cases should be allowed, but I appreciate that will put, some ethical and practical pressure on you, on your profession. And at least generally speaking, if you're not in Texas, when you're a lawyer, nobody dies, unless you're a refugee lawyer, where you are often, heartbreakingly advising people who are off to a horrible fate. But I do appreciate that yours is an enormous burden. Is there?
Thank you. Shami, we're going to take 2 last ones, and they're both at number 1. So.
Okay.
Stephen Willett, GP from Nottingham, thank you for coming. Your number 1 of rights involves the issue of inequalities. Along the same bus routes in many of the towns of our country, life expectancy changes 10, maybe even 15 years along the same route, and GPs are unfairly differently remunerated, such that it's very hard to recruit to the inner city. Any suggestions of how we tackle this inequality?
Right.
As I say, it is the moment for dissent, in my view. I live in a smart middle-class house in central London opposite a food bank. I grew up in the 80s, and maybe I have a bad memory, but I don't remember food banks even in the 80s. So the inequality is everywhere, and it is chronic. This is an increasingly unequal and divided country, and I don't think one has to even be party political to have concerns from one's own practice and experience about that. And my view is that this college and other professionals have an ethical duty to speak up about their experience and to help nudge or shame or mobilise those in power to reflect on the divided country that they are ruling. I hope, for example, I hope that this college will form policy, perhaps at its AGM, on the Human Rights Act. I think that people want to hear from GPs who they trust. They don't always trust lawyers or politicians or journalists. I think that you have a voice, it's a trusted voice, and I don't think you should be afraid to use it.
Thank you.